Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and I'm back once again to bring Gungnir, the spear of Odin, against misconceptions in Norse mythology. And this one I might characterize as sort of falling within that three-part meme structure: broke, woke, bespoke. Broke, I have read Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology or something like that, and that's where I get my ideas about Norse mythology from. Woke, I have read the Poetic and the Prose Edda, and that's where I get my ideas about Norse mythology from. Bespoke, I have read the Poetic and the Prose Edda, and I treat the Prose Edda as a secondary source about the Poetic Edda, which is my primary source. So what I just want to emphasize is that Snorri Sturluson, when he wrote the Prose Edda, and if you're extra into this and have taken an interest in some readings that are a little bit less common, also wrote Heimskringla, the History of the Kings of Norway, which has a lot about the Norse gods in its very earliest part. Snorri is a medieval Christian, and before you play the scary piano sting and say, well, that means that everything that he wrote is subject to Christian influence, yes, but that doesn't mean what angry bearded people on the internet want to tell you that it means. It doesn't mean that he's making up stories. I think in some cases he's misunderstanding details and transmitting them a little bit wrong. But the real way that Christian influence, scare piano sting again, comes up is that it makes him want everything to be more systematic and coherent than it is in our poetic sources, right? The Poetic Edda is a mixtape. These poems are not composed by the same people all at the same time. And so there are going to be minor contradictions because these stories are transmitted orally, right? They're not actually written down during the Viking Age when people believe in them. Although we can trust by linguistic evidence, which I've discussed in the introduction to the second edition of the Poetic Edda, as well as on a video or two, that these poems actually do date back to oral composition during the Viking Age before the conversion. He doesn't really get that his pagan forebears in Iceland and Norway didn't have a canon, right? They didn't have a pope. They didn't have agreed understandings across large international areas about what God was the father of what God and things like that. There were broad consensuses, but there were also details people could disagree on. And Snorri sometimes misunderstands a single word. For example, he'll misunderstand Allfather, which probably means almighty, all Lord, Lord of all is a title of Odin. He misunderstands that as all father because he doesn't remember the second word in that. It's archaic by his own time. So if we read the poems of the Poetic Edda, we are occasionally going to find characters that we don't understand anything more about. So, for example, there's extremely little about gods like Heimdallr and Tyr in the Poetic Edda, right? Tyr, we have hints, lost his hand to the wolf Fenrir. Heimdallr, we know, is the guardian of the gods. For some reason, Völuspá stanza 1 is addressed to the children of Heimdall, sons of Heimdallr. But we don't even necessarily know what that means, contrary to popular insistence that we do. And turning to Snorri to clarify these things is never a bad idea, but we can't trust that Snorri always knows the answer to the questions that come up in reading a text that was composed often 300 years before his lifetime. Snorri also, probably most damningly from my perspective in terms of what confuses people today, wants to justify his interest in his pagan forebears' gods by suggesting that these gods were not really gods, but in fact these are Trojans. And this is part of a really common pattern in medieval Europe where learned Christians have encountered classical literature, right? They've encountered the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they know who Greeks are, but they say, well, who are Trojans? Oh, well, those are us. And so you have versions of this from Iceland in the form of Snorri's Prose Edda. You have versions of this about the British. You have versions of this about the Albanians. Everybody wants to be the Trojans, but nobody in the pre-Christian North knew who Odysseus was, right? Loki is not Odysseus, contrary to Snorri trying to jam the two of them together. And the thought would never have occurred to a pre-Christian Norseman, and the conclusion would never have made sense to a pre-Christian Norseman. That is Snorri basically being a medieval academic and saying, well, here's my theory, right? Because these can't be God. Like the Bible tells us who God is, so who were they? And going a little bit crazy with it, right? He's got his grand theory of everything, and his grand theory of everything is that, like, oh, okay, well, the reason that our ancestors who forgot about the true God worship these other guys is because they were Trojans, and they were really awesome and rich and powerful, and they took them as gods instead. Snorri is a native speaker of Old Norse, although at a later stage of development than the language that we see in the poems of the Poetic Edda. It's certainly at a later stage of development than the skaldic poems that he quotes in Skaldskaparamál, which are some of the most valuable parts of the Prose Edda. So we should take him as a very valuable secondary source, and not just ignore him and say like, oh, well, anything we don't like that's quote-unquote Christian influence. But we do need to keep in mind how he systematically distorts the information that he gets from orally transmitted poems in order to fit a certain frame, and that frame is largely conditioned by his being an educated medieval Christian. Now, this is not me insulting Snorri. I am sure he knew more about Norse mythology sleeping than I ever have awake. But that doesn't mean that he transmitted it always correctly and faithfully to following generations, which, I'm not going to either. But I salute him for trying. And, I think that we can respect him without having to accept, something as obviously fabricated as his Trojan narrative. All right. Hey, not a paid endorsement. Thanks to Shawnee at Life of the Party in Fort Collins, Colorado for Gungnir here. She also provided the costume that I used in the 2024 April Fool's video when I played Gausvaldur Thorensson, who I think is the version of me that people actually wish would present on this channel.
Who are you?
I'm Dr. Gausvaldur Thorensson. I am the pastor at the local Odinist chapter.
I'm really not interested.
I'm trying to nice way. Oh, hello. Welcome to Dr. Gausvaldur Thorensson's exercise hour. One never knows when Ragnarok is coming, and so you must spend time preparing both the body and the mind. I set a map of my homeland.
I didn't use any costumes for this year's April Fool's video, but I really enjoyed making it. It was my first foray into conlanging, making up a language, and I enjoyed making up the worst possible language that I could conceptualize and an even worse alphabet than that. But at least it's still not linear B. All right, folks. Well, hey, thanks for supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for buying my books, especially the second edition of the Poetic Edda. Check it out, even if you have the first edition. I think you'll like it. And check out the classes that I'm offering on Zoom in April and May, including detailed reading of Völuspá and Havamal in Old Norse. You don't have to know Old Norse. You can read it in translation if you want, but I will explain to you all the details, all the questions, all the different interpretations, exactly what's really there, and what's a matter of later interpretation, whether Snorri's or somebody more recent than that. All right, folks. Well, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.